So tonight we have Dr. Jon Trappe. Hopefully I'm saying that right. John. Okay, perfect. And he is going to talk to us about fall lawn care. But before we begin, I just wanted to call your attention to the chat box. Make sure that you're using the chat box for any comments that you have or talking with other participants, and then using the Q&A box for questions that you might have. John would like to have questions asked during out the presentation, so we will interrupt him if you have any questions. So we want to make it interactive and answer your questions right away. With that, I will give it up to you, John.
Sounds good. Thank you. And thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I always enjoy talking with people people who are looking for any kind of lawn or turf advice. So, my as was mentioned by Emily, my name is Jon Trappe. I'm the Turfgrass Extension Educator for the University of Minnesota. What that basically means is anybody in the state that handles turf in any kind of way, my job is to basically provide support to them. So if you have lawn care questions, or if you're a golf course superintendent, athletic field manager, anything like that, my job is to basically either translate research that we're doing, conduct some research, or to basically just put on some general education like what we're going to be doing tonight. So we're going to be talking about the fall lawn care best practices. Again, as was mentioned, if you do have questions, just drop them, type them up in the chat, and we'll try to address them as soon as possible. Just that way, if you have a question, there's a good chance other people are going to as well. So I always like to begin by telling you where you can find some information. I'm also going to close with this, but you can find we have a number of really great resources online. There's the Turf website, which is a lot of information that's geared a little bit more towards professionals, but we also have something called the Lawn Care newsletter that you can subscribe to. It's free. All of this information on the University of Minnesota web pages is free, or at least the extension related web pages. This is the other extension web page. This is geared a little bit more towards homeowners. I'm going to be referencing a number of different extension web pages where if you're interested in learning a little bit more about something than what we can cover in an hour, this is where you would go to find that information. So extension.umn.edu, lawns and landscapes. You can just use your favorite web search engine and just type in extension UMN lawn care, and you'll get there that way too. So we're going to be talking about fall best management practices, but let's think in terms of what are all of the practices. So you've got, of course, mowing, fertilizing, watering. Maybe tree leaf removal is pretty typical for this time of year. Weed control, thatch management is one that I get a lot of questions about. Soil compaction or aeration, maybe insect pests like white grubs, diseases, or establishing or renovating a lawn. Now, as far as if you look at all of these practices and you think about them in terms of, okay, the growing season in Minnesota, April to November, for most years, anyways, this is, if we think about them and we think about, okay, when is the best time of year to be doing these practices? Uh, there's this graphic that we have that's called the lawn care calendar, and it has the acceptable denoted with an capital A, and then the preferred time of year to do each of these practices. And you'll notice that most of the acceptable and preferred are in the spring and in the fall, but most of the preferred are actually in the fall. The fall is the best time of year if you're looking to have a healthier, more functional lawn. That's when it's the best time for fertilization, weed control, for establishment, if you're looking to do it from seed or sod. Really, the best time of the year for doing most practices is in the fall.
John, can I stop you really quick? I'm not sure if you're supposed to be sharing your screen or not.
Oh my word, am I not?
No.
Rookie mistake. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I got all excited. Yeah. So I apologize for that. so you should be able to see that now. Is that correct?
Yep, I can see it. It's just not in presenter mode right
Yep.
now.
Yeah, getting there right
Yep,
now.
there we go.
Okay. So here's what I was just talking about. Let me, from the recording purposes, there's the turf.umn.edu webpage. There's also the extension webpage where you can get more homeowner related content, especially not just in particular to lawns, but also really great resources. So these are the list of the typical lawn care practices, and this is the lawn care calendar. And you'll notice from the calendar perspective, most of the practices that we're doing are best preferred or best performed in the fall. So if we were to break down most management decisions that people are doing into their lawn into just a couple of key things that they could focus on, mowing, fertilization, and weed control would be them. This is the vast majority of questions that I get from homeowners about their lawns. And this is frankly the thing that people have that's in their control that most people could do to have a great lawn. And this has historically been the three that we've always focused on. The last couple of years, you'd probably imagine, especially right now, where we're in the warmest and driest fall that we've ever had on record, watering is becoming a bigger factor in terms of lawn management. Now, all of these things, something I'm not really going into a whole lot of detail, at least unless I get some questions on, all of these things are going to be based on or going to be affected by the turfgrass species you have growing in your lawn. And we've done a lot of research on this to figure out, okay, which species are people actually growing in their lawns? Most people have at least 4 to 5 different species, but we still have to talk about the species as individuals because in many cases they prefer certain climates. And even within a lawn, if you have a south facing sunny spot that dries out a little bit faster, you might have a little bit more tall fescue there. But if you have a shaded area that's also dry or even wet for that matter, you might find a lot more fine fescues in that part of your lawn. But the turfgrass species really affects everything, every management decision that we talk about. But you could spend literally hours talking about the differences in turfgrass species, and most people are not changing the species that they have in their lawn unless they have a significant die off. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the management practices that people can be doing this fall or even next spring and growing season. So we're going to first talk about mowing because that's what people uh, immediately think of when they think about lawn control is or lawn management is mowing. And one of the more common questions or thoughts is how often should I mow? And really, it's more of a function of when it needs it, not necessarily what day of the week it is. So we recommend to never remove more than 1/3 of the turfgrass plant in a single mowing. That's what determines the quote unquote need for how often it needs to be mowed. Here's an example when more than 1/3 of the above ground tissue was removed. We call this scalping or shearing. This is a quite stressful on the lawn, regardless of the time of year. But we really try to base the mowing practice off of this 1/3 rule. And we know that this 1/3 rule really plays into how much of a stress is mowing actually on your lawn. And we also know that, for example, based on the 1/3 rule, that if you just simply raise your mowing height, it effectively means you actually have to mow less often than if you had a shorter mowing height. So take a look, for example, here at if you were to commonly or regularly mow your lawn at 3 inches, if you follow the 1/3 rule, you would mow it when it gets up to about 4.5 inches tall. And that would happen, and let's just say, for example, that happens about every 7.5 days in throughout the growing season. But if you mow according to the 1/3 rule and you mow at 4 inches instead, just simply raising the mowing height 1 inch, you would mow it once the lawn gets to 6 inches, and that would mean that you would mow it about every 10 days. So simply raising the mowing height means that you actually mow it less throughout the year. And this is a little bit counterintuitive for a lot of people. I think most people think, oh, if I mow it shorter, that means I have to mow it less often. You're actually stressing the lawn out. And I'll show a couple of examples here in a little bit on why that's not necessarily a good thing. Mowing height it dramatically impacts the rooting of the plants. So if it helps you, some people kind of visualize, okay, for as much for if you're trying to visualize, okay, how much what's the root system of my maple tree? Some people say, well, you have as many roots below ground as you have all of the branches and stems above ground. And that's for the most part, that's pretty true with grasses as well. So if you increase the mowing height, you actually increase the rooting depth. And deeper roots is an overall healthier plant. It's going to have access to more water. It's going to be more drought tolerant, and it's going to need less supplemental watering throughout the year. So as far as specifically in the fall, uh, we recommend to mow to at least 3 inches for the majority of the fall. You can lower the mowing height a little bit before the winter, but I would not lower it any lower than 2 inches. And the reason for this is that lowering of the mowing height can actually reduce snow mold. It also helps a little bit with leaf mulching, or if you have too many tree leaves and you need to remove them, that's when that's having a little bit lower mowing height can actually help do that. We recommend to almost always mulch or return the lawn clippings as you mow, and that's true even in the fall. This is what we don't want to see, which is collecting the lawn clippings and having them to be composted off-site. This is if you bag your clippings, you're essentially removing nutrients from your soil and from your lawn. And so you're basically just donating them to the local compost if that's where you're taking them. Or if you have your own compost pile, sure, that works. But for if you were to bag your clippings throughout the year, you're going to be removing about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet for the year. That equates to about half to 1/3 of the amount of nitrogen that we recommend to be applied for most lawns. So you effectively have to double, in some cases, the amount of nitrogen applied if you're bagging or collecting your clippings throughout the year. Of course, you have the added labor expense and things like that. That's why we always recommend to mulch or to return the clippings as you mow. Now, what does this mean for tree leaves? Well, similarly, for the same reasons, we recommend to mulch those tree leaves as you're mowing and not to bag them and collect them and have them composted off site. But there's a caveat here. Eventually, it all depends on how much tree leaf litter you have. So I recommend as just to mulch or to return these tree leaves as you're mowing. Um, and until you can basically see less than 50% of your lawn. And then at that point, I would start bagging the tree leaves as you mow, or as you collect the tree leaves for any more that fall throughout the year. I would collect, if you start seeing less or more tree leaves than lawn, at that point, that's when I would start collecting the leaves to be composted offsite. And that's largely because excessive tree leaves can actually cause snow mold. That's what this dead and seemingly dead turf looks like here for much of this lawn. Is this lawn care company? This was in 2023. You might remember 22 and into 23, we had really excessive snowfall throughout the year or throughout the winter. And this was a really bad year for snow mold. And it also, if tree leaves fell too late in the year, eventually you just couldn't get them collected before the snow actually fell. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. Most of this lawn in particular, and that by the following growing season, most of that had recovered. Snow mold very rarely causes total death of the lawn, especially if you're using more snow mold resistant turfgrass species like the fine fescue or Kentucky bluegrass. So when fertilizing turf, we've talked about mowing. Next, we're going to talk about fertilization. So why do we fertilize turf? We fertilize turf because the plants need nutrients to grow and develop, and oftentimes the soil is not capable of providing all of the required plant nutrients. It's not to say that every lawn needs to be fertilized, but most would probably benefit from some fertilization, periodic fertilization. We fertilize because we're trying to time those fertilization practices when the lawns are most likely to use them and when other weeds like crabgrass, for example, which is a summer annual, when it can't take them up. So we're trying to promote the functional aspects of a lawn, and we time those in the fall uh, because that's when our grass plants are typically growing the most, and then that's when weed pressure is the least. So, from a timing perspective, September and October are the most important time frames of the year. May is the third or preferred option. If you were to fertilize 3 times per year, these are the months that I would do it in September, October, and May. And again, that's largely because that's when the plants need it the most. So, how much to actually fertilize? It really depends on your soil and how you're using the lawn. But we base all of our fertilizer programs for all lawns off of nitrogen. Nitrogen is the first number if you look at a fertilizer bag and you might see a 25, 5, 15, or for example. That first number, that 25, that's the percent nitrogen in that bag. Nitrogen is the most important nutrient for all plants. Grasses are not an exception. Unfortunately, we can't soil test for nitrogen, but we can test for organic matter with a soil test. And higher organic matter means you have higher organic soil nitrogen that's already available for the plants, or it will become available for plants over time. So if you have higher soil organic matter, that typically means you need less supplemental nitrogen from fertilizer over time. Which species you have growing your lawn dramatically affects how much nitrogen your lawn would actually benefit from. So things like Kentucky bluegrass, it's a little bit higher nitrogen requiring turfgrass species, 3 to 5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet for the year. Tall fescues and the fine fescues are substantially lower than that, one third to one half that amount of nitrogen. Uh, so it really pays to know which turfgrass species you have growing because if you want to have as good of a lawn as you possibly can, you can tailor your management practices to that species. In terms of other nutrients, nitrogen isn't just the only thing, but it is the most important. But for the most part, unless you're collecting clippings, soil nutrients are going to be relatively stable over time. It's not like in an agricultural soil or even in a garden, a home garden, where you're growing something, you're harvesting the crop. You're every time you harvest that, you're removing nutrients from that system. In a lawn, most nutrients are basically the same as long as you're not bagging or collecting clippings over time. You can conduct a soil test, and I absolutely suggest everyone to do this at least at some point for their lawn. And a soil test is going to be a good indication for things like phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, manganese. Uh, the most important thing, in my opinion, most valuable thing other than phosphorus and potassium from a soil test report is going to tell you the organic matter content. Now, if you collect and have your soil analyzed from the University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab, they do include that with a basic soil test report, the percent organic matter. It costs about $20 per sample. It's relatively inexpensive. Most lawns it really only need about one soil test. And I would recommend to do it every 3 to 5 years. But quite frankly, again, like I said, the nutrient status over time is really stable unless you're bagging clippings. But I would definitely have your soil sampled at least once. Now, Minnesota does have something a little bit unique because we have, and especially in lawns, because we have a phosphorus fertilizer law. Now, what that means is that there's actually a restriction or it's prohibited when and where you can apply phosphorus to your lawn. So there's a restriction on how much phosphorus can be applied. You need to have a soil test if you're going to apply phosphorus that shows it's deficient or that shows that your soil would benefit from that amount of phosphorus. Otherwise, if you're establishing a new stand, you can apply phosphorus. We don't necessarily suggest that unless your soil test is showing a deficiency, again, which you would need to have a soil test report for. But at new establishments can apply phosphorus as well. Golf courses are a little bit exempt, but they still have to get formal training to be able to apply phosphorus. Now, with that in mind, around 70% of soils in Minnesota are already sufficient or high in phosphorus. It's literally the reason why the law was created wasn't because phosphorus from lawns was damaging waterways. It was really more about conserving this resource or preventing people from unnecessarily applying phosphorus to their lawns. And about 7 out of 10 lawns across the state do not or would not benefit from any phosphorus. So, what does this mean for fall fertilization? Where we're at today, in for most years, we're already too late to still be applying phosphorus, and that's especially true for this Tri-County area. But we are having a warmer and drier year than normal, so there's still a little bit of the growing season apparently left. So it's not done. So I don't think it's quite too late for that right now. But I would definitely be a little bit concerned after the next week or two in terms of fall fertilization. So, as I mentioned earlier, the fall is the best time to fertilize. September to October 15th is the normal time frame that we recommend. This year we're a little bit warmer. If you do have an irrigation system or if we do get some rain, I think at that point, any time the lawn is actively growing, is a good time to fertilize if you think the lawn needs it. In terms of what source or what type of fertilizer to use, I would recommend using water-soluble nitrogen. That means anything that, like a urea or ammonium sulfate fertilizer, those are the preferred sources. They work a little bit better in colder conditions. Ammonium sulfate would be my preference if I had to choose one of those two. You can buy this at most garden centers, or if you go to your local feed mill or seed mill or a feed store for if you've got a co-op or anything like that, they have bags of ammonium sulfate there. Now if you go to big box stores, a lot of times you'll see winterizer fertilizers marketed and promoted for this time of year. They're okay. They work. The winterizer really just means it's added potassium in there. And if your soil is already sufficient in potassium, with which a soil test report would show, then adding more potassium is literally a waste of money. So that's why I started off by recommending urea or ammonium sulfate fertilizers. Those are fertilizer sources that only have nitrogen in them, and they're the cheapest. They're the most efficient, and for most lawns, that's what I'd recommend. Just make sure, regardless of your fertilizer source, that it's watered in after the application. Now, if you don't have an irrigation system, uh, then I would really be focusing on what is the current moisture stress or moisture condition for your lawn. If it's already drought stressed, I would definitely avoid fertilizing it. We don't want to encourage the plant to grow. And quite frankly, if your soil is dry, it's not going to be as efficient as taking up that fertilizer. So, if you do have an irrigation system, you can fertilize really any time right now. Just make sure you water it in and that your lawn is actually still growing and it's not drought stressed. But really another week or two of we it looks like we have about another 10 days of decent growing weather. After that, I'd be a little bit nervous about applying any more fertilizer simply because I don't think the plants are really going to be growing much more after that. But I could be wrong. We could have this type of weather pattern into early November, and if that's the case, I think you could fertilize up until then. It's really more based on the growing conditions. If we have temperatures in the mid 60s or higher, then the plants are probably actively growing as long as they're not drought stressed. So we're going to move into weed control. Uh, so far, no questions. So if you do have questions, just shout them out. I feel like I'm cranking through a lot of this content, but that's quite all right. If you don't have any questions. So, in terms of weed control, this is something that's certainly a little bit more objective in terms of uh, what people think is important. But we're going to talk we're going to hopefully cover all of our bases for this. And regardless of what you feel about weed control, hopefully you'll learn something from this. So I love asking this question, what is a weed? It's truly one of those scenarios where it's beauty's in the eye of the beholder, because a weed is really any plant that's out of place. Some people consider turfgrass as a weed if they're growing in their garden, where they don't want them. In the case of these images on the screen, we've got on the left, we have creeping thyme. This is a broadleaf flowering plant that we actually intentionally plant for bee lawn mixtures. This is something that native bees really prefer, and it's something that's being added to more and more lawns as a way of promoting habitat for pollinators. In that particular context, that is not a weed, but in other circumstances, it could be considered a weed to someone else's lawn if they're not necessarily concerned about, promoting habitat for pollinators. Now, in this boulevard example, this is a pure stand of creeping Charlie or ground ivy. Uh, maybe to somebody this is certainly this is acceptable, and maybe they even like the purple flowers in the springtime. I have my own thoughts on this. Then I would say because it's a boulevard, I probably wouldn't want the creeping Charlie there. But in this particular case, maybe someone's perfectly fine with that. Uh, as far as having that, and it's not officially a weed to them. So why do we control weeds? The first answer, if I ask professionals or if I ask master gardeners or sometimes homeowners, it seems like the first thing that pops into people's mind is, well, I don't like seeing the yellow flower out in my lawn. Uh, that's sure that can, that's important for the aesthetics for some people, but the real reason why we control weeds uh, and why we recommend controlling weeds in many circumstances is because they compete with the plants that we are trying to grow for space and resources. And those resources could be nutrients, water, sunlight, any number of resources or anything that the plants that we do want to grow that they need. In some cases, weeds reduce the function of turfgrass areas. So if you've got three kids and a golden retriever, uh, that yard is being used quite a bit, then having more weeds in that lawn is going to change how safe it is or how much it can tolerate the traffic of those kids and that dog. We control weeds for reducing the amount of unwanted pests in a given area. Sometimes and this is something that I think is fascinating. If I'm speaking to people from a more rural counties, they're like, I ask them, why do you have a lawn? And they say, well, I don't want to have ticks and I don't want to have snakes and other pests, getting up around the house where we are. But if you talk with people in the metro area, they've got a complete, they've got very different idea of why they want to have a lawn and why they want to control weeds. Weeds can also be an important source of allergens. So, what is the best weed control? Truly, and we know this from literally decades, pretty much a century of research, that a dense and healthy turf is the best defense against weeds. So, if you do not provide the space for those weeds to encroach, you're going to have fewer weeds over time. So, if you promote a dense and healthy turf and you follow our best management practices, over time you're going to need to use less herbicides for managing those weeds because simply there's less space for them to move into. And I have this comment up here. Last year's voids is this year's space for weeds. And in this particular stand, you can see it's very thin on this right stand over here. You can see a lot of soil here. And of course, it's very weedy. If you provide the space, nature is going to fill up that void because nature hates a void. So, a dense and healthy turf is the best defense against weeds, and management practices play a very important role in how dense or how healthy that turf is. So, here's an example of management practices affecting weeds. If you look at this image on the screen, you'll notice a lot of lime green grass growing amongst the rest of this darker or normal green grass. And you'll see a lot here on the left and in the background. This whole area has received the same amount of herbicide, but this lime green, this crabgrass, seems to only be growing in certain parts of it. Why is that? It simply is nothing more than just the mowing height. So if you raise your mowing height, up to the recommended level, which is 3 inches or higher, you're going to reduce the amount of crabgrass that you have in your lawn over time. So, uh, doing nothing without even applying any herbicides or really doing anything, as long as you're managing your lawn as we recommend, you uh, you'll have less weed pressure from things like crabgrass over time. Now, I did mention earlier a dense and healthy turf, and we already talked. We've actually already seen this lawn one time. This is that lawn that had those tree leaves. How did we get this crabgrass, this lime green grass growing in the background up here? It's because we had some death over the winter. That death was the result of not collecting or having too much tree leaf litter on the surface. Got snow mold, and it eventually killed out that lawn in that area, and that's how the crabgrass got into this space. So let's say we do have some weeds present. How are we going to manage them? Well, I think it really comes down to what types of weeds do you have growing there. If you have perennial weeds, that's going to really, those are going to be much more difficult to manage through best management practices compared to summer annual weeds like crabgrass. Herbicides typically are recommended more often for aggressive perennial weeds that are encroaching. Those are the types of weeds that once you get them, they're probably going to be there for a while. No amount of cultural practices are going to remove creeping Charlie from a lawn. Uh, Similarly, if you're renovating or establishing a new lawn, that's also a really important time where I would consider using herbicides. Uh, just whether they're synthetic herbicides or natural herbicides, regardless of that, I would consider using some kind of more proactive management just to make sure our lawn gets off to a good start. Now, if you are going to be using herbicides, make sure that you always read the label and apply only as directed from that label. It's literally the law. If you apply it off label, or if you don't follow the label instructions, whether it's the amount that you're mixing up, how you're spraying it, when you're spraying it, it's literally breaking the law. It's part of it's part of an agreement. Anytime you purchase a herbicide, it's just something to keep in mind. Of course, if you are going to be trying to manage weeds, it's good to know thy enemy, or know which weed it is that you're trying to control. Because the life cycle, it plays a really important part of when that weed is easiest to control, or whether or not you should even control it at all. Maybe it's not even a weed. So really understand which weeds you have for trying to manage them. One of the most common products on the market, weed and feed type products, they have both fertilizer and some kind of herbicide component in them. I think they're garbage. I do not recommend anybody to be using weed and feed products. If you already have them purchased, sure, go ahead and use them, but they're just not very effective at controlling weeds. I think that they can lead to herbicide resistance in lawn settings, especially if you're not rotating the different products that you're using. They're just overall not very effective. And unfortunately, they're positioned at a price point to where they're oftentimes the same price as the standard fertilizer with the exact same analysis. So, uh, but just focus on buying an actual fertilizer source that doesn't have that weed component or that herbicide in with the fertilizer. I mentioned the importance of being able to identify the weed. We actually have a tool or a web page where you can walk through on identifying uh, what the plant is if you're unsure about it, how you can identify it to learn, okay, is it a weed in my lawn, or is this something I should be concerned about in my landscape beds? Is this plant a weed is the name of the web page. You can get through it through the extension.umn.edu web page as well.
John, we
Uh,
do have a question.
sure.
Is creeping Charlie considered an invasive species?
So that is a good question. Currently, it is not considered an invasive. Well, I should back up here. So there are certain levels for what the DNR considers invasive. So there can be aggressive species, there can be invasive, there can be noxious, and there's certain legal ramifications with those. So creeping Charlie is an invasive species. but it is not a noxious weed species. So, noxious, depending on the classification of the noxious, in some cases you're required to manage them. Buckthorn is one of those weed species that where it does carry a noxious it does carry a noxious title, but I don't think you're legally required to remove it from your landscape. But because it's not the most aggressive or most noxious of weed sources. Creeping Charlie technically is invasive, but it's not noxious. So you're not legally required to remove it, but it is something to really be concerned about. And there's a number of reasons for that. Creeping Charlie is slightly allelopathic. That means it basically releases a chemical to make itself more competitive in the environment. It it typically grows best in shaded, moist conditions, but you can find it growing just fine in really full sun, dry conditions as well. Once you get Creeping Charlie, you're probably going to have it for a while.
Another follow-up question that someone put in the Q&A, how can you get rid of creeping Charlie from your lawn?
We're going to talk about that in about 2 minutes.
All right.
So, uh, okay, so we've identified what the plants are. If you have a smartphone, you can also there's a number of apps that you can use for identifying what the plants are. Most of the major smartphones, like Androids or iPhones, they literally have a photo identification tool built into them, and it just uses an image search function on the internet, and it'll tell you what species you actually have growing there. So, but there's also other apps like iNaturalist or Picture This that work pretty well at identifying plants. Now, certain weed species are what we call indicator weeds. Now, what this means is that if you have these weeds present, oftentimes it's an indication of some other underlying reason. And that's because these weed species are capable of competing against the lawn or other plants if you are growing something else. They're better at growing in these conditions than the plants we're trying to grow. So, for example, if you have white clover and or black medic or birdsfoot trefoil, oftentimes that's an indication of low nitrogen conditions. And there's a number of different weed species that we could go through here, but really, what these are just an indication that you have some kind of underlying problem. And if you don't address that underlying problem, say, for example, you have a lot of white clover and black medic in your lawn, if you don't address the fact that it's probably low in nitrogen, you're just going to get, even if you were to go through and control these weed species and remove them from your lawn, you're probably just going to get them again. So it's kind of a holistic approach for thinking about or like a thinking big picture about your lawn. Even if you had a silver bullet and you could go out and remove every single unwanted plant from your landscape, it's still not a very long-term strategy or solution. So simply applying the appropriate amount of fertilizer is going to reduce the amount of white clover you have in your lawn or the amount of black medic, for example. Now, if you have most simple broadleaves, like and by simple I mean they're perennial plants that really just spread by seed. They don't creep, they don't spread by rhizomes or stolons or anything like that. These examples of these are like dandelions, broadleaf plantain. Uh, Most broadleaf herbicides work really well on these weeds. And most three-way or four-way herbicides, if you go to your favorite big box store and you buy the concentrated formulation to control broadleaf weeds in your lawn or selectively control them, they're going to contain 3 to 4 of these active ingredients. So 2,4-D, dicamba, triclopyr, mecoprop, and fluroxypyr. These are the ibuprofen of Advil. So these are not the name of the herbicide. These are what the herbicide contain that actually work towards the problem. There's also iron chelate, which is more of a natural. It's not truly organic, but it's more of a natural formulation. It's not a synthetic herbicide. It does have some efficacy or control on things like dandelions or broadleaf plantain. It can work pretty well, but I would just temper your expectations. It's not going to remove every single broadleaf weed species from your lawn. Now, the more difficult to control weeds like creeping Charlie or ground ivy Those are really only managed with using the herbicide triclopyr. There are other herbicides like fluroxypyr and dicamba that do have a little bit of activity on these creeping broadleaf weeds, but the triclopyr is the one that works the best. So the ground ivy, creeping Charlie, uh, those are the two same wheat species, just different common names. There's also things like wild violet or creeping bellflower. These are the active ingredients that work best on these more difficult to control broadleaf weed species. Something to keep in mind, they're probably going to need multiple applications because they have all these underground or above ground in some cases, creeping stems. And those creeping stems, those hold a lot of carbohydrates that can outgrow or outlast the herbicide inside the plant. So you want something that's going to translocate and kill off all of those different plant parts. Now, down to the brass tacks. Is it still okay to be trying to control these broadleaf weed species? Actually, right now is the best time to try to control them, really any time until the soil freezes. Just follow the label instructions. It'll tell you on how late in the year you can actually apply these. But most broadleaf weeds, especially the difficult to control ones like Creeping Charlie and Wild Violets, they're best controlled in the late fall, early winter. Fewer, you also have the added benefit of the fact that there's fewer pollinators and other insects that are going to be out at these time frames. So even if they were susceptible, they're just not going to be there and be exposed to these herbicides. Uh, but if you think about how the plants are actually growing, they're storing their energy for next year. They're basically sending every piece of energy that they're producing, they're sending it to their roots or their storage structures. And just as they're doing that, they're going to be translocating that herbicide. It makes them much easier to control this time of year. Now, with the important footnote here is do not apply herbicides to drought-stressed turf. If you have an unirrigated lawn and it hasn't been watered, you haven't had any rainfall, I would avoid applying any herbicides and stressing out that turf anymore. It might be a situation where if you can't water and you can't, but you do have a lot of weeds, it may be a situation you just toss in the towel and wait for next year. So it's really site specific, but that is something to consider there. Now, one of the most asked about questions is crabgrass. This fall is not normally something we're thinking about crabgrass because it's already dead, because it's a summer annual. It germinates in the spring, grows, develops throughout the summer, sets seed in around the middle of August, and then dies towards the middle of September. Uh, the best way of managing crabgrass is by using a pre-emergent herbicide. And I would really only use those if you know you have a lot of crabgrass that's year over year you're fighting crabgrass. That's when I would consider using a crabgrass pre-emergent. You can apply those anytime before soil temperatures reach 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Spring applied is best. So as far as you could technically apply it right now, but that herbicide is going to run out probably by middle of June or early June in some cases. And that crabgrass pre-emergent, it's going to run out. You're going to start getting crabgrass to germinate in middle of June next year, and you're just going to have a bunch of crabgrass plants anyways. So spring applied is best. Keep in mind if you have less predictable weather, you're probably going to have more post-emergent control necessary. So a crabgrass pre-emergent only works for seedlings or seeds that have not germinated yet. Now, we do have a tool to help homeowners and turf professionals uh, identify when is the best time to put down a crabgrass pre-emergent in the spring. You can literally zoom in on this tool and drop a pin on your home, or if you've got, let's say, a property or a number of properties you're managing, you can do the same with this. It basically pulls in local weather station data, and it'll tell you based on soil and air temperatures whether it's too early, the best time of the year, or it's too late to apply a crabgrass pre-emergent herbicide. This is how you get to it. This is at the turf.umn.edu page. This is the turf dashboard. You can see the link highlighted up there in the red circle. Keep in mind that some areas are going to be much more prone to weeds than others. You see the sidewalk here. It's very This is a sidewalk that gets a lot of salt, so there's a lot of salt damage on the turf there. Even if you're using a salt tolerant species like the fine fescues, uh, you may end up having some salt damage there year over year. And if that's the case, maybe I would just consider not planting a salt tolerant turfgrass species like the fine fescues, but I would just basically consider looking at mulch and things like that. But in some cases, along driveways, sidewalks, maybe on a curb, you're going to find that, that there are it's much more areas that are much more prone to weeds than others. Maybe you don't need to apply a crabgrass pre-emergent across the whole lawn if you know it's just going to be in just this one part. And of course, there are other reasons, like I mentioned, nature loves to fill a void. So if you have stress lawns, which is a lot of Minnesota has right now because of the drought and higher temperatures, maybe consider it an opportunity for planting more drought tolerant turf grasses. The tall fescues and the fine fescues are the most drought tolerant turf grass species that we can recommend in Minnesota for lawns. And those are the ones that I would recommend. Now, just because your lawn is drought stressed doesn't necessarily mean it's dead. This is an example of a lawn in St. Paul in late July. Here's what it looked like just over a month later once we started getting some more predictable rainfall. So just because it's brown doesn't mean it's unhealthy. Now, I do have to mention that this is in June or July and August, where you have an entire fall to recover. What is a drought what does a record-setting drought look like in September and October for Minnesota lawns? The quick answer is we don't know because most of our drought stress research has focused on summer months, summer stress. So I'm gonna talk about this in a little bit, but just something to keep in mind. If it is drought stressed, maybe I would consider watering it at this time of the year while you still can before temperatures drop too much. Now, we have spent quite a bit of resources and time and energy trying to develop turfgrass species that use less water or that need less water. So we do a lot of research screening different turfgrass species and cultivars for that. We even simulate drought where we prevent moisture from getting onto certain turfgrass plots. Here's an example of a plot of fine fescues at 14 days without any moisture. This is that same plot, 64 days. We're not quite to that just yet, at least at the Landscape Arboretum where my office is. Um, we have not had rain since August 24th. That's in Chanhassen. That's pretty substantial length of time. We're still not quite to that 64 days, but we're getting pretty close. So here's an example of fine fescues, 14 days without water, 64 days without water, and then simply adding maybe a rainfall on day 65 can recover very nicely. These plants are certainly capable of going into a dormancy to avoid the drought stress. It's just we don't quite know what that means for the fall just yet. If you're looking to make your lawn more drought tolerant, we recommend planting drought tolerant species like the fine fescues and tall fescue, raising your mowing height, like I mentioned before, and using better irrigation technologies if you do have an irrigation system. Now, in the state of Minnesota, all automated irrigation systems need to have a rainfall sensor. Those are very cheap. They pay for themselves, and we absolutely recommend folks to be using them because they save substantial amounts of water. And there's even rebate programs and things like that for different cities and things to offset the cost for any moisture sensors to upgrade irrigation systems. So the real question is should I water my lawn yet this fall? And I would say if it is drought stressed, like many of the lawns around Chanhassen, for example, that I drive by every day for work, I would recommend watering at this point. Uh, Mostly because the plants are still using water because we're getting these higher temperatures, especially this weekend, for example. I would just water them to rehydrate the plants uh, as they before going into the winter time period. If they're not drought stressed, if your particular area has gotten a little bit of rain, one of the lucky ones, then I would just keep an eye on the weather, just and watch your lawn, of course, and just keep an eye if it's crunchy when you're walking across it, or If it's really matted down like what you see here and there's literally no green in it, at that point I would start considering applying some moisture before the winter. Now, aeration is something that I mentioned earlier in the lawn care calendar as being the best time to do it in the fall. Uh, we're pretty much too late right now to aerate in the fall, and most places are too dry to aerate. You're just not going to get very much soil penetration from the aerator. So, but it is best in the fall, and we use aeration to relieve soil compaction. Uh, there's this kind of misnomer out there that that aeration is used to reduce thatch in a lawn. It really does very little in terms of thatch management. We recommend most lawns get aerated about every 3 to 5 years. This soil compaction reduces the amount of rooting, so it affects things like water infiltration and the drought tolerance of the lawn. And so some aeration is beneficial for most lawns. It's just a lot of it depends on the soil type. Things that are more silty or clay type, especially, they're probably going to need a little bit more aeration than sandier soils, for example. So signs that your lawn would benefit from some aeration. If you see ponding of water after light or moderate rainfall, it's a good indication. If you've got thin turf in full sun conditions with adequate moisture and nutrients, that thin turf is often an indication of soil compaction. Or if you see plantains or knotweed, uh, which are two or three different weed species there, oftentimes those are a key indication for compacted soil. Now, dethatching is a whole nother problem altogether, and most people have a misunderstanding about thatch and what it means for your lawn. Some thatch is actually a good thing. It's basically just partially decomposed plant tissue on the soil surface. And the vast majority of people overestimate how much thatch they actually have. In this particular image on the screen, this is of a sod that's being laid. This is about half to 3/4 of an inch of thatch. There's virtually no soil with this sod, but this is a pretty dense layer of thatch there that you can see. We really recommend, thatch is really only ever a problem in Kentucky bluegrass lawns. That's KBG on the screen. Uh, Kentucky bluegrass lawns that are receiving quite a bit of nitrogen, they probably have an irrigation system. If you've got one of those and or both of those conditions and your thatch is 3/4 of an inch or more, at that point, I would consider dethatching. Now, what does that mean? Mechanical dethatching is there's literally tools that you can rent from your local equipment rental place. That's a lawn dethatcher, and they work really well. I think they're much best. I think they're best to be done in the spring, in the late spring or early fall, but certainly not right now. There are liquid dethatchers that you might see advertisements for online. They do not work. Don't waste your money buying a liquid dethatcher. Mechanical dethatching is the only thing that works. Uh, so, last thing we're going to mention before we open up for some more questions is what can be done for improving your lawn with seed for this time of year. And I think it really breaks down into two categories. So if you've got an irrigation system, I would say that mid-August to mid-September for most of Minnesota, especially the Tri-County area, that where most of you are located, if you have an irrigation system, that's the best time to improve your lawn with seed. If you don't have an irrigation system, which is most lawns do not, you're going to most likely benefit from a dormant or frost seeding as being the best time of the year for improving your lawn by seed. You can also do early September seeding as the second best. On normal rainfall years, this is definitely not one of those. So dormant seeding or frost seeding is the best. Now, what does that mean? Now, what does dormant seeding mean? Here's an example of some turf research plots we have in St. Paul. This is an example of a lawn of really an area where we were demonstrating how to dormant seed. Now, this whole area had different management prior to the overseeding, but they were all overseeded at the same time in November of 2022. Now, in some cases, we were seeding into perennial ryegrass, which is a fairly standard lawn grass. Typically, we don't recommend it to be planted as a monostand, but where we literally uh, were seeding or overseeding in November uh, with multiple turfgrass species into this area. And we sprayed out this perennial ryegrass using glyphosate or Roundup and seeding on literally the exact same day. We actually spread the seed first and then sprayed this area. And you'll notice this actually has pretty dang good coverage over here, where we had for pretty much all of the species we evaluated, we had pretty high efficacy. So if you're looking to renovate your lawn, spraying it with glyphosate or Roundup prior to dormant seeding can be effective. Now, here's an example in the dead center where we literally had just bare soil. There was no weeds, there was no grasses, there was nothing. We just dormant seeded over onto this bare soil and we did not cover it. And you'll notice there's a lot of thin areas in certain plots. Some turfgrass species, each of these horizontally is a different turfgrass species. Some of these did much better regardless of the cover type, but others just did not establish well if they were bare soil with a dormant seeding. Now, this area over here on the far right, this is an area that was also bare soil, but we covered it with a germination blanket called Futera. This is, if you do have bare soil, we recommend covering it with a germination blanket, especially if you're doing a dormant seeding. That protects the seeds over winter, and it also allows for retention of moisture in the springtime. So when we were dormant seeding, we literally just spread the seed. We do not do any soil disturbance. In some cases, maybe we killed the existing vegetation, or in other cases, we covered up the seed bed with a germination blanket after the fact. But dormant seeding is by far the best way if someone's looking to improve their lawn with seed. Dormant seeding is kind of foolproof. For most lawns, it's literally just spreading the seed over the lawn surface and just allowing that natural freeze thaw cycle over winter to work that seed down into the soil, and it really promotes seed to soil contact, which is so important for establishment. If you are going to seed into some existing vegetation, whether it's dead or alive, you don't have to use a germination blanket or a germination cover. Uh, you also do not need to rake or disturb the soil. That's what the freeze thaw cycle, the snow, winter rains, those all help get the seed into the soil. If you are going to dormant seed in Minnesota, you're really doing it anytime soil temperatures are frozen. So November to March is fairly typical. If you are dormant seeding, just make sure you're not using a crabgrass preventer in the springtime because it'll almost certainly affect crabgrass, or excuse me, it'll almost certainly affect the grass seed germination in the springtime. Now, as far as what a germination cover looks like, here's an example of two different types. One is this pelleted mulch. This can work pretty well if you're dealing with just really small, thin areas, but the germination blankets, like what's demonstrated over here on the right, these are what work best. They're a little bit more expensive. They're a little bit more difficult to handle, but if you do have a bigger area that's bare soil, say for an entire boulevard or big swaths of an area, they work best. So some of the takeaway messages for tonight. The historic drought that we're in is basically in the driver's seat in determining a lot of the management decisions that we should be doing for our lawns. Uh, I would avoid doing too much if it stays this dry, or if winter arrives in a week or two. The lawn itself, if you can't get out and water it, or if you can't do any of the other practices, there's your lawn's probably going to be fine until next spring. But if you're looking to basically improve it, I would be pretty active with the management in terms of the amount of watering I'm doing in order to not be doing these other management practices to an already stressed lawn. I would water your lawn and your other perennial plants, like even trees, for example, if they are dry. I would mulch the tree leaves as you mow until you cannot. So that's around that 50% mark. If you're seeing more mulch leaves on the surface than grass, at that point, I would look at picking up the leaves over winter. Or excuse me, late fall. I would collect the tree leaves again if less than 50% of the lawn is visible. It's probably too late to fertilize for most people, but if you do have an irrigation system or if you are okay with watering, uh, in that case, then maybe it's not too late. I would use the ammonium sulfate or urea-based fertilizers that I mentioned. And perennial broadleaf weeds can be controlled, but if your lawn's really drought stressed, maybe I would just toss in the towel for this year or wait for some rainfall if you can before trying to manage those weeds. With that said, these are the links that I mentioned and showed earlier. This is where you can get all kinds of great information. We do have a lawn care newsletter. I do much of the writing for myself for um, that's on a monthly basis. We don't spam you, but it's all timely information. I definitely recommend you check it out. There's also Yard and Garden News, which is another really helpful newsletter that's not just lawn related, but it's also more broadly useful for your lawn. With that, I'm going to open it up to any questions if there are any. I see that there are a couple of questions here.
Hmm.
Um, Awesome. So let's go ahead and chat about those.
So the first one is, I think, in relation to one of the slides earlier about like the characteristics of the lawn and what we could do more. So Linda is asking for the yellow wood sorrel, should she water more to control that?
Yep. So let me just pull up to the lawn indicator species. Yellow wood sorrel is a legume. It's typically not it can be an indication for drought stress. At that point, what I would consider doing, it can help to water your lawn in the springtime, or excuse me, before it gets drought stressed. But I would focus more on if you are seeing this year over year, yellowwood sorrel is an indication for dry conditions. It's also an indication for low nitrogen. So I would do two things. One, I would not worry about managing it. It's kind of a weak perennial. It does spread pretty aggressively by seed, but you can address that through proper management, through proper fertilization. Irrigating more is normally a bad idea if you're trying to do that to reduce the amount of weed pressure. If you're having to water more, what I would consider doing to reduce the amount of weeds you have, what I would do is I would look at planting or overseeding or dormant seeding with more drought tolerant species in that particular case, like the tall fescue and the fine fescues. Okay. Will aeration make a lawn more or less lumpy? Uh, Aeration does not actually have much of an impact at all on how lumpy a lawn is. It could, in theory, help a little bit because you're basically pulling cores and you're spreading those out on the surface, and those break down and kind of resettle over time. If you have a raking or if you have a like a landscape smoother or planer, those can actually work really well for smoothing out really bumpy lawn. And doing that after an aeration can be really beneficial. Uh, but uh, but most people's idea of what a bumpy lawn is, most of the time that's caused by things like earthworms. You can roll it in the late or in the early spring. Sometimes that'll, for any earthworm middens that have been left on the surface from last fall, sometimes those harden and then eventually the plants just grow on that little mound. And then, your lawn just remains bumpy over time. That can You can roll that and try to help with that. Otherwise, I would go through and try to use a leaf rake, either and try to aggressively rake down those mounds if you can, if your lawn is thin enough to be able to do that. But aeration is can be something to help with that as long as you're smoothing out those cores from the aeration itself. Do mice eat grass seed? Not that I know of. There are other insects and things like that that will eat the grass seed, but predation from insects or moles or voles with a V, those typically is not much of a concern for dormant seeding. I've never seen an instance where dormant seeding failed because something was eating it. Now, birds, on the other hand, could be a little bit of an issue, especially if you have a bare soil and the seed is not covered. But for the most part, if you're seeding into an existing dead or even alive grass or weeds that are there, you can just leave those, and they're going to be protected enough from other animals from eating on them. So Judy is asking, what if you have a sandy hill and prefer not to reseed with grass? Other plant options. We do have a web page on the extension webpage on plants for growing in difficult places. That's what I would consult there because it really depends on how you're using it. If you've got a hill and you don't like to, it dries out all the time. uh, I would just make sure you have something that can tolerate the drought and can tolerate the typically it's hotter conditions, especially if it's south facing. So something that's going to tolerate high heat and drought stress. Uh, I would look at that web page called Plants for Growing Plants in Difficult Places. Uh, and there's a list for excessive shade, excessive moisture, for all of these, and that includes non-lawn type plants. But whatever you do, I would consider just planting something that's going to be a perennial, that's going to hold that soil in place. In many cases, maybe what you could do if you're not necessarily keen on mowing it, there are no-mow fine fescues and other grass options that you can use. Grasses work really well for holding soil in place, especially on hillsides. So even though I'm hugely biased in favor of grasses, I would just consider the long-term implications and whether or not you can actually plant them in that area. So with that, are there any other questions? I'm hearing nothing but crickets. Not even hearing that.
They can't unmute, so
Oh, yes. Well,
it's not.
yes. I guess I wouldn't hear anything in that case. So, I can hang around for a little bit longer if you'd like, but if that was all the questions, then by all means, that's great. One thing I did not include was my contact information. What I can do here is I will add this to the screen, or we can actually just put it here in the chat. So this is my email address. Um, so if you do have specific lawn care questions, they're problematic. We also have Ask a Master Gardener that you can reach out to for some of the more simple questions. That works really well because we have a really great Master Gardener team to be able to answer some of these types of questions. But otherwise, you've got my email as well.
Great.
Uh,
Thanks, John. Just a reminder for everyone that once you exit the Zoom, you will be directed to a survey. So it would be really great if you completed the survey so we know if you learned something from the program tonight and what we can do better for next time. Also, just a reminder that this webinar is recorded and I will send out an email to you with that link and also the link to our YouTube channel where it will be posted so you can refer back to it as time goes on. With that, I will stop the recording. Thank you, John, for being here.